I'm here now, though, as the first of the three presenters under the Global Issues session. And my topic is Halal Animals. I will try to keep to the 1 o'clock stop time, at which time we'll take a break before we turn over to Jonathan Leborn's presentation. So I'm working on a book project called Halal Animals to be published by Oxford University Press. And it deals with animal welfare debates within and about the halal industry. So I'm just presenting a tiny portion of the book project today with a focus on two specific animal welfare issues within the halal industry, the means of slaughter and the issue of live exports. Now, from the US perspective, you might be wondering, why focus on the halal industry? Here it's a very tiny fraction of the overall meat production industry, and there are many greater numbers in the so-called secular industry that need addressing. But if we take a global view, actually halal is extremely significant. Indeed, the industry is absolutely booming. The market value for halal food reached 1.4 trillion last year, and it's expected to continue to rise dramatically. The processed food and beverages includes meat. And meat continues to be the vast majority of halal certified food and beverages: lamb, mutton, beef, and chicken, to name the most common ones consumed. But behind these vast and growing numbers, of course, stand the non-human animals, the billions of sheep, cattle, chickens, and other species whose lives are at the foundation of this industry. So the question is, what issues do they face? And my book will also allude to the comparative issues. What issues do they uniquely face? So first of all, quickly, what is halal anyway? Halal literally means permissible and can refer to anything from personal behavior to financial practices to food choices. You've probably seen this symbol, maybe you have, in your research or as you study what kind of food products are in the supermarkets. Not, of course, while you're buying meat. I know that you don't buy meat, but you may have seen this in advertisements. That's the halal symbol. They're in English and Arabic, and this is the Australian symbol of halal. So Islamic law provides particular rules that must be followed in order for the animal's meat to be considered halal or permissible to consume. So first, the animal must be permissible to consume at all. That excludes the pig and some kinds of fish. So to start, the welfare issues associated with pig simply don't exist in the world of halal. That's good news. But it doesn't mean that pigs aren't present or raised for food in Muslim-majority countries, because in some cases, Christians or others are allowed to do so. Most of the rules of halal in the meat context focus on the means of slaughter. They really don't deal with how animals are raised. And that's a significant challenge I will deal with a little bit later. The slaughter rules are typically presented in very technical and sterile terms. And here they are. A sharp instrument, doesn't have to be a knife, but it usually is used to cut the jugular veins, carotid arteries, esophagus, and trachea of the animal, generally in a single cut. The animal must die from blood loss due to that cut. Note this means that the animal must be alive at the time of the throat cut. That will become more relevant later. The slaughterer should be a Muslim or maybe a Christian or a Jew. And the slaughterer should invoke the name of God at the moment of slaughter. Okay. These are the general rules with some differences depending on the particular Islamic scholar who's making the rules in any one particular jurisdiction. But this apparent simplicity hides many complexities. Notably, there's not one worldwide standard for halal. There's no one international halal certifying body. Instead, many countries actually have multiple halal certifiers, often with slightly different requirements that can be quite significant from an animal welfare perspective. And some countries impose a uniform standard of halal, like Malaysia does. All right, those are the rules for when an animal is killed for food. But what about consumption, right? Does halal require meat eating? Or does it drive meat eating? Not exactly, but how much meat, what kind of meat, and at what meals are cultural questions that are going to differ from country to country. But there's something specific that has to be raised here, and that's a religious holiday called Eid al-Adha, literally Festival of the Sacrifice. Eid al-Adha takes place at the end of a particular month the month of the pilgrimage, when Muslims make a pilgrimage to Mecca, Saudi Arabia. It's the lunar calendar, so it moves forward every year. What is this festival of the sacrifice? It commemorates Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son before God sends an animal instead to be killed. In the Muslim version of the story, the son is called Ismail. And the idea is that every Muslim who can afford to pay for an animal to be slaughtered is expected to do so on this holiday, with a portion of the meat distributed to charity. Further, it's considered exemplary behavior for individuals to do the slaughter themselves. In Saudi Arabia, on this holiday, the period of time in which animals are slaughtered is about 3 days. And the slaughterhouses in Mecca have slaughtered as many as 1 million animals in that period. So if we do the math, it's a very, very, very fast process. This rapid process raises significant animal welfare concerns. Everywhere else in the Muslim world, the holiday is confined to 1 day usually, and estimates of the number of animals slaughtered on this day worldwide are simply impossible to make because there are just so many. There's so many. So the emphasis or the belief about individuals slaughtering their own animals creates the potential for many untrained individuals to carry out the slaughter. Not just the potential, but the reality. There are also tremendous human health issues and safety concerns, especially when animals are carved up on sidewalks, streets, on balconies, stairwells of apartment buildings. I mean, I've seen all of that. And some countries have tried to limit individuals doing the slaughter, not really for animal welfare concerns, but for the human health and safety concerns I just mentioned. But this holiday also means that there's a tremendous amount of demand for live animals on that particular day all around the world, and that's an issue I'll return to in a few minutes. But first of all, or next, I want to give a short introduction to the international halal markets before talking about the welfare concerns. So we have to know where do Muslims live in order to know where halal takes place. So this world distribution of Muslim population map, it looks better from your perspective. You have a bigger version than I have on the screen. It's by the Pew Charitable Trust, and it shows us each country's relative size based on its Muslim population by the millions. So obviously, we're irrelevant. Right? The U.S. is irrelevant in this picture, but you see where the vast numbers of Muslims are, and that's the halal areas that I'm studying. I'm not really looking at the U.S. and Europe for the most part. What's really interesting and important is that these Muslim majority countries are not self-sufficient in meat. In fact, far from it. In recent figures, 85% of meat and live animal imports to Muslim majority countries, the big ones on the screen, come from non-Muslim majority countries. So halal is not about the Muslim world supplying the Muslim world. It's about the non-Muslim world supplying the Muslim world. In fact, the 4 biggest producers of halal meat are India, Brazil, Australia, and New Zealand. Of those, only India has a Muslim majority of any size, although, of course, it's a Hindu nation. Australia is one of the world's largest food exporters for halal. And you can see here, while the green shows the halal meat exported, the red shows the live exports, which, of course, is small in comparison. But the point to be made is Australia is a major halal player, and I'm going to focus on Australia to show a couple of points going forward. In 2017, in addition to all this frozen, chilled, vacuum-packed meat, revolutions in vacuum packing play a big role in the decline of live exports, but that's a side thing that fascinates me, but perhaps vacuum packing doesn't thrill everyone, but it's a major animal welfare advance. But anyway, what I want to say about Australia and the live export industry is that last year it exported about 1 million cattle, mainly to Indonesia, and about 2 million sheep, mainly to Kuwait and Qatar. Australia is also an unexpected halal supplier. Its own Muslim population is about 2%. So what does this transnational supply chain mean? Non-Muslim countries supplying Muslim countries. It means that multiple standards are going to be at play in these international transactions. And those standards may not be the same from animal welfare perspectives. Right? Kuwait does not have the same animal welfare standards as Australia. Australia, for all its shortcomings, has very high animal welfare standards. Comparatively, Kuwait or Qatar or Egypt has very low standards. It also means that a large number of live animals in addition are transported to the Muslim world also from great distances. So this leads to the two most significant welfare issues I want to talk about. The slaughter issue, because as I mentioned, the slaughter protections in Kuwait or Qatar will be much lower than they are in Australia, and the live transport issues. All right, so let's talk about the means of slaughter first. So recall the simple elements of halal slaughter. Basically, the animal dies from blood loss due to the cut to the throat. Okay? In North American and European slaughterhouses and in many other parts of the world, animals are often stunned or attempted to be rendered insensible to pain prior to the cutting of the animal's throat, right? Or otherwise prior to draining the blood of the animal. So stunning as a concept was not necessarily invented for animal welfare reasons, although it's now seen as serving two equally important goals: animal welfare and slaughterhouse efficiency, which worker safety would go along with it. There are several kinds of stunning, some of which can cause the death of the animal, while others are not lethal, but rather reversible. So take electric stunning, for example. That's the one on your left. It's the most common form used on sheep. When the electric current is directed to the animal's head and a certain range of voltage, the result is temporary state of unconsciousness. If the throat is then cut, the animal will die from blood loss before regaining unconsciousness. But if left alone for a few minutes, the animal will regain consciousness. It's merely a stun. So what does that technical detail about reversible stunning have to do with halal? It's actually very important. In halal, the animal must die from the loss of blood. If the stun itself kills the animal, then the meat can never be considered halal, even if you cut the throat and drain the blood afterwards. To the contrary, the meat is haram. It's impermissible, and eating it is a sin by the person eating it. So the stakes are very high. So if the stunning process kills the animal, then the religious authorities opining on the halal certification in any one jurisdiction will not allow it. In fact, this reversible stunning I just mentioned was invented in New Zealand to satisfy halal markets across the Middle East. They were trying to start a big export business, and they needed to be accepted by their consumers. So that sounds, fine, but the problem is that the line between a stun that merely stuns and a stun that causes death is not always that clear. The religious scholars who make decisions about what is and what is not permissible in a halal slaughter process express concern that even the reversible stun could kill the animal because the animal was weak to begin with, because the voltage was set too high inadvertently, for example. And because no one would know that the death had occurred because, of course, the animal looks unconscious, and in a high-volume factory farm, no one's checking, right, to see. The animal could go through processing and enter the halal meat supply. The fact that the meat is haram and the consumer of it is committed a sin is a big problem, right? It's a big obstacle to getting stunning accepted. Because of this element of doubt, a large number of scholars will not accept stunning of any kind. And in fact, they're most suspicious of stunning of poultry because they think that poultry is small and weak, and it's more likely that a slight overage of the voltage or a slight illness could cause the death of the animal in the stunning process. So now you're probably thinking, come on, stunning is not a panacea. Stunning doesn't make slaughter humane. And errors in stunning can and do happen even in the most developed of countries. But overall, when talking about better and worse, and when talking about the pain of slaughter and nothing else, I think there's no question that from an animal welfare perspective, stunning is better. So let me just prove that to you very quickly. First, consider how long does it take an animal to die from blood loss? That tells us how long the pain of slaughter lasts. It depends on the species. It's actually quite interesting, but in general, without stunning, the delay between cutting the throat and death from blood loss is up to 20 seconds in sheep, 25 seconds in pigs, up to 2 minutes in cattle, up to 2.5 minutes in poultry, and sometimes 15 minutes or more in fish. And cattle are particularly interesting, and I can talk about cattle biology if you want to know more about that. Cattle are particularly vulnerable to a prolonged and painful bleeding out process. All right, second, what kind of pain, right? How do we know? How do we know what kind of pain it is? How serious is it? Well, a series of studies in New Zealand in 2009 relied on EEG brain waves in calves to assess the pain with and without stunning. So using EEG brain waves, which is a technique pioneered on the human body to assess pain, they're able to anesthetize calves, so they're actually not feeling the pain, but their brain waves are recording whether or not there's a noxious stimuli. And they showed quite clearly that slaughter without stunning, a throat cut, is a noxious stimuli, a very high one, and that stunning prior to the throat cut eliminated the EEG brainwaves. Now again, this is under perfect conditions. I do want to emphasize that, but I still think it is quite relevant. Okay, so the scientific literature on stunning does not end the debate on stunning, because many Islamic scholars will still hold firm to the primary concern that eating a dead animal is a sin, and if there's any chance of that, they won't endorse it. But what about the argument that, yeah, but it's painful to the animal? What about the pain to the animal? Does that matter? I'm going to come back to that in my the last part of the talk, the unfulfilled promise of halal. But I want to just add here, before I move on to that there's another element to these stunning debates that make the science not even the ultimate arbiters. We know science doesn't necessarily convince people of anything. There's a view, I've heard a million times, maybe a million is an exaggeration, that traditional Islamic slaughter, in the way that I described to you, is perfect. Perfect, and I don't mean to sound irreverent, but this is what's stated. It's perfect because that's what the Prophet did. And nothing can be improved upon. I hear it all the time, and it's difficult to engage in a conversation when there isn't the acceptance by some very conservative Islamic scholars of something new. All right, now I want to turn to the second animal welfare issue, which is live exports. Then I'll wrap it all up by talking about what I'm calling the unfulfilled promise of animal welfare in the halal industry. So, live exports. So the issue of live exports is actually entirely related to what I've just been talking about. It's related because if there's a rejection of stunning as performed in Australia and New Zealand, then you don't want Australian or New Zealand meat coming into your country, right? You want the live animal, so you can slaughter the animal the way you want. And Australia and New Zealand require all animals to be stunned before they're killed. All right, so there's also, of course, the demand for live animals on the particular holiday I talked about. So recall that Muslim-majority countries are not self-sufficient in the meat they consume, and that does mean that there's a tremendous trade in frozen or chilled meat. But we have these demands, and there are countries, Australia and Brazil, who are willing to fulfill the demand. New Zealand, for example, no longer ships live animals for slaughter. They will ship live animals for dairy or for reproductive purposes, but not for slaughter. But Australia will, Brazil will, Uruguay will. There are countries who are willing to fulfill the demand. All right, so why are live exports and animal welfare a concern? This is a vast topic, and I just want to cover some of the highlights, again, using Australia as an example. Well, first, the long distances, right? The long distance from Australia to the Middle East in particular can take several weeks. So, just looking at the obvious point of geography, I don't think my pointer is working, but, the ports of Darwin are down here, and here we have Kuwait, right? Here we have Qatar. Here we have the United Arab Emirates, right? Up through the Red Sea to Egypt. Notice also the equator. It's going to be important to what I'm going to say in just a second. But we have long distances. Second, the conditions on the ships. This includes everything from what is called stocking density, i.e. how packed they are, to temperature, to the fact that there is, at best, one veterinarian on board. At best, one. And that's Australia. I don't even believe Brazil requires a veterinarian to be on board. Just you see the volume, just the volume of it. The animals do not always manage to eat the pelleted feed on ships, even after a transitional period in a feedlot, because these sheep, for example, were grazing on grass in Australia. By crossing the equator, they travel from the Australian winter to the Middle Eastern summer. And those of you who've been in the Middle East in the summer, right, the Persian Gulf, 100, 110, 120. Darwin, pretty chilly there. It's a desert terrain. They travel across a major transition in temperature, and this can lead to heat stroke. So mortality rates of 2% for sheep and 1% for cattle are considered normal. Higher death rates require the shipper to inform the Australian authorities, who may be but are not required to undertake an investigation. This means that on this ship of 70,000 sheep, the death of less than 1,400 is just an acceptable loss of inventory. So until rather recently, there was very little information about what the conditions were like on board. We can imagine them, but there was very little information because no one outside the industry was ever allowed on a ship to see. All that was known was self-reported by the industry, such as mortality rates, and even those were a little bit questionable in their accuracy. Several years ago, information did reach the public by a veterinarian, Australian veterinarian Lynn Simpson, who had traveled 50 journeys and finally was essentially fed up and was forced to go public. She presented her information within the government. They outed her. They forced her to be a whistleblower, basically to destroy her career. And then she decided, well, I'm really going to speak up now. And we actually had her last year to talk. So she had very important information, but it was her information. It was from still photographs she had taken on many voyages. But just last April, a much better source of information was revealed by a very, very brave Pakistani who was an engineer on the ship, who had worked on several ships carrying them sheep from Australia to the Middle East, and he kept a video diary. He was incredibly brave to have done so. As you'll see in a minute, he could have been thrown overboard and no one would have ever known. The prominent Australian news program, 60 Minutes, aired an expose based on his material. I highly suggest that you watch it, just in April. One voyage he sailed last August carried 63,000 sheep, and 2,400 died due to heat. I'll just go through this slide really quickly. That's what it looks like. That's what heat stroke looks like. If you've ever been around sheep, they never do that. As absolutely, in no way, normal behavior for a sheep, even on a hot day, but I'll pass over that quickly. Most of those deaths from heat stroke occurred once the ship reached the Persian Gulf, where temperatures exceed 100 Fahrenheit easily, and the sheep packed into the pens literally cooked to death. As is protocol, not aberrant, the bodies are thrown overboard, and that's what that is. So the manure and the bodies are dumped into the ocean, and that's a picture that Lynn took, just standing on the deck one day watching the trail from behind the ship. All right, there's much more to be said about the problems of live exports, including the fact that when the animals arrive, they're slaughtered under local conditions by the importing country, which probably doesn't include stunning, and there's probably no animal welfare law in place. It's also an environmental issue. But in the interest of time, I want to just end now with this brief section on the unfulfilled promise, animal welfare promise of halal. So I gave to you at the beginning of the talk the requirements for the slaughter of an animal in order for meat to be considered halal. And in terms of the label halal, that's really just about it. The rules of halal don't deal with how the animal is raised, or really not much of anything about what the animal's life was like up to the moment of slaughter. And remember also how important it is, because consumption of non-halal meats is a sinful act of haram. I should say of haram meat, not halal meat. That's sinful. And yet that's not at all the end of the topic of animal welfare in Islamic law. And to the contrary, and I've written a lot about this, if anyone wants to read more, the Islamic legal tradition is full of concern for animal welfare. In fact, greater than any of the monotheistic religions, by far greater. Tons of concern for animal welfare, including farmed animals. So the question is, can that be used to harness an internal reform conversation? So return to the issue that the animal must be alive, or merely alive, at the time of slaughter. Some scholars have broadened this rule out a little bit to to say, well, let's avoid doubt. And let's say that it's not just alive or merely alive, but let's say that the slaughter can't come from a sick and dying animal, especially an animal sort of literally on her deathbed. So I've taken that concept and argued that that concept really should prevent live exports. And once Faisal's footage came to light, there's a big debate in Australia right now about, oh, is there any way we can salvage the sheep trade, right? Is there any way we can alleviate the concerns that Faisal showed? And one way was suggested was to reduce stocking density by 28%. And I said, no, absolutely not. That doesn't change anything. And in fact, I want to add a new argument to the mix, which is that it may be the case that these animals can never produce halal meat. And the quote here, which is a little bit blurry, is a U.S. expert in Islamic law says agricultural ministers and clerics in Kuwait and Qatar would be unlikely to view summer transport of sheep as halal approved if they were shown the crowded conditions and animals forced to stand for weeks in their own excrement. The idea is that these animals are suffering organ damage from heat stroke. They survive, but they are still in the end stages of organ failure. So they're killed, right, literally on their deathbed. So I'm harnessing that concept of doubt and saying, don't slaughter an animal who gets off these boats because they may be on their deathbed. And that, according to some scholars, is tantamount to slaughtering a dead animal, which of course is a contradiction in terms. I became so frustrated by the doubt argument being used against stunning. Well, there's doubt the animal could be killed, so don't stun, that I thought, well, let's turn it around and say that doubt could be a good argument. Let's use it here. Let's stop all shipments, especially when we're going into the Middle Eastern summer. And of course, the Australian advocates are working very hard to stop the trade using their own secular arguments. I'm just kind of highlighting for you what Islamic law could possibly do. All right, so what else can Islamic law do? Here's the last thing I want to say. Many of the legal sources on animal welfare come from sayings of the Prophet who died in 632, and his normative statements are law. Let's look at a couple of them. Again, 632, it's a very progressive tradition on animal welfare. The Prophet saw a man who had put his sheep on her side, and while he was sharpening his knife, the sheep was watching over him. The Prophet said, "Do you want to kill her many times over? Why didn't you sharpen your knife before you put her on the side?" Another, a butcher approached a sheep in order to slaughter her, and the sheep escaped and ran to the Prophet, with the butcher running behind. The butcher began to drag her by the leg, and the Prophet told him to herd her gently. And one more, when you must kill a living thing, do it in the best manner. And when you slaughter an animal, you should use the best method and sharpen your knife so as to cause the animal as little pain as possible. These sayings seem intended to protect the interests of the animals. There's no explicit sense that there is a human benefit to these sayings, although one could construe that the quality of meat of an animal who's so terrified at the time of death is poor. But I think it's fair to say there's an interest here in the animal's welfare. So, why aren't these sayings a necessary part of the halal certification? If the best manner isn't used, why doesn't that render the meat impermissible, right? Not halal. Why, if the animal is dragged to slaughter, including drugged on a boat, right, does that allow the meat to still remain halal? Well, this is a tricky point. These are considered ethical injunctions. It's a wrongful, sinful act to do these things, to violate these rules, but it doesn't jeopardize the halal status. Okay? So this is basically what's going on. We have the matter of rules versus ethical principles, or non-justiciable principles, perhaps. We have a matter of law versus ethics. The religious scholars are firm on this point. Don't bring these ethics into the halal rules. Why is that the case? I can talk about that for a long time. But one theory is that because eating haram meat or non-halal meat is a sin, the scholars were cautious to keep the rules of halal very narrow in an effort to really make most meat that comes through the system halal in the end of the day. But there is some hope. There is some tiny effort to make something out of these ethical injunctions. So almost no one I've talked to will bring them into the halal certification rules themselves, but there is an effort to develop something of a rating system, right, that sort of parallels the ratings, the welfare system in secular meat that would be attached along to the halal certification that would say halal, with 5 gold stars, or halal with 4 gold stars. It's all halal. 1 gold star is still halal. No gold star is still halal. But if you're concerned about ethics, you can look for the gold rating system. It doesn't get to the heart of the matter, but it would make animal welfare an issue of more of a public discussion than it has been before. The issue is there. The conversations are there. They're starting. You can see them. I see them in these different countries. Jordan is leading this in many ways. I mean, they're percolating, like bit by bit, place by place, but there's still movement that has to take place before it becomes a real concerted effort. So with my book, I'm hoping to provoke and push this conversation further, and if it's controversial, but I think that the people who are consuming halal meat do have the right and should have the knowledge that ethical injunctions and other animal welfare concerns should be as much a part of the conversation, or much more than it is now. So I will stop there. And 5 minutes?
Sure, yeah, we have some questions.
To stay right on time?
Just raise your hands and I'll do my best to Phil Donahue to come and grab wherever you are. Anyone have any questions?
What is Jordan doing exactly?
Please use the microphone. We're recording.
Yeah. What is Jordan doing exactly?
So Jordan is a fascinating case study of many positive things, right? So Animals Australia does a lot of investigations throughout the world in which their animals are sent. And they always uncover terrible practices, including several years ago, they found terrible practices in Jordan. And they always tried to work within the system first. So they sent the footage to the king, who said, actually, my sister is kind of interested in animals, and it went over to Princess Alia, who said, oh my gosh, this is wrong, come talk to me. And it led to a partnership between Animals Australia and the kingdom to improve the slaughterhouse. And in part, it was a conversation with the religious authorities to get them to endorse stunning used in the slaughterhouses. So I got a tour of all the major slaughterhouses in Jordan last December and saw stunning used quite effectively in some of the big ones, and then in some of the ones it wasn't used. Because, well, our customers are worried, there's doubt, there's other things. But Princess Alia, through the Princess Alia Foundation, is extremely attentive and worried and cares about these things very deeply. And oftentimes you really need that leadership, right? You need someone within the country who cares, and then you often need an external partner who will be there on a sustained basis, right, to help these things go into place. It doesn't help to put a stunning device into a country where there's only electricity an hour a day. I mean, that's not Jordan, right? But that is some places. So you have to be very cautious about what you're doing.
My question was, maybe you've already answered it, why Muslim countries aren't doing more to produce their own meat?
Yeah, so thank you for asking that. So it depends on the country. Let's talk about the Persian Gulf for a second, right? What is there? Has anyone been to Dubai or Abu Dhabi or Qatar? Small countries, desert, tremendous wealth. So what do you do when you're really wealthy, right? You drive fancy cars and you eat a lot of meats. I mean, that's true. You eat meat 3 times a day. You eat meat as often as you can because your ancestors were poor. They were pearl divers, right? They didn't have access to meat maybe once a month. So these are high meat consumption countries with almost no domestic capacity to produce really much agricultural products at all. Camels, yes, but camels are eaten, but not to a large extent. Sheep is preferred. Indonesia, on the other end of the spectrum, huge country, not very wealthy at all, has just the terrain. There's no grazing land. There's no grazing land, and in fact, with Australia, the relationship it's a love-hate relationship, and so they say for every 5 or 10 cattle for slaughter you send us, we want 1 breeding cattle, because we want to become self-sufficient by 2015, by 2020, by 2025, right? The date kind of keeps getting pushed further into the future, and so now there's a relationship between, and this plays into the environmental part as well, the Northern Territory of Australia that I showed you, Darwin and up in there, it's desert, and these animals forage, and they can't get to quote-unquote finishing weight on the basis of what they can forage. So Australia would either have to ship in a lot of very expensive animal feed to get them from 75% to 100%, but what does Indonesia have? A lot of stuff to finish a cattle on. What is it? It's the byproducts of palm oil plantations. So they're shipped not very far, so we can say that's not a terrible welfare transport. And then they arrive, and then they're fattened, so to speak, on these palm oil plantations, or other ways in which they're literally fed the refuse of industrial production from any kind of food manufacturing process. And they're fattened and slaughtered there. So there's a symbiotic relationship, but that's why Indonesia doesn't have a lot of self. Now you may be saying, why aren't they eating fish? And of course this relates to the rise in red meat consumption as an indicator of middle class status, right, that we unfortunately see in so many parts of the world.
Any other questions? Yep.
Hold
on one sec for the mic.
Diets have similar issues. Are they strict?
Sorry, recording.
Yeah. Sorry. I was just curious if you knew about kosher foods and if strict kosher rules are as strict as these.
Yeah, so there's a lot written about kosher. So to the contrary of this, so if you're interested, I can tell you, but kosher is tougher actually. Well, it is and it isn't. We could do a map of the kosher eating world. It's not going to look like the halal eating world, right? So we're talking about different numbers, right? Smaller numbers. But the kosher rule, and I'm no expert, but I'll just tell you what I understand from my reading, is that the animal is not just alive, but can have no blemish or injury. And so stunning is seen as per se an injury or a blemish on the animal. And there has been a universal rejection of stunning within the kosher industry. Stunning prior to the throat cut. Now, there's some who are talking about an alternative. Because once the throat's been cut, the kosher requirement has been fulfilled. And then you stun. So the animal gets the initial pain of the throat cut, but then a second or two later, if the stun is rendered, then you save the animal from the subsequent 2 minutes or so. But even that is not at all common, and it's advocated by, I don't want to say progressive, or I don't know what the correct word would be in the Jewish tradition, but it's really only advocated by a few. And I've done a lot of reading on the history of our own Humane Method of Slaughter Act, and by the way, we allow for either religious slaughter, that means no stunning, or slaughter with stunning. And the concern there by the Jewish community at the time was, you start to regulate us this much, and you're going to go straight down the path to Nazi Germany. And they weren't wrong in thinking that, because actually removing religious slaughter in Europe pre-World War II was actually often a very clear anti-Semitic, we don't want you here statements. And so that community had been very, very strict at the time. No regulation of any kind, don't touch this in any way. Now you see more concerns after the big Iowa agriprocessors scandal. You see a little more conversation, but the stunning, I think it's going to be a much harder. Now, if I had all the time in the world, we could talk about kosher and halal clean meats and other ways to escape these problems, but that's a quick answer to your question. Anything else?
Here you go.
Yeah.
This is really informative and illuminating and obviously very disturbing, and I think that many of us don't have visibility into this whole subject area, and I was really curious how you got on the path to studying this. What brought this to your attention? What was your interest? Why did you decide to pursue this?
So I'll say just as quick as I can. So I went to graduate school to do Islamic history, Islamic legal history. I lived in Egypt while I was doing my research. It was not on these topics. It was on market regulation, and I wanted to volunteer, do something for the society, get to know Egyptians. I ended up getting to know Egyptians who were starting the first animal shelter in the country. Got really involved with them. My days became more animals and less dissertation research as time went on. The proportion shifted. And then 2004, 5, and 6 is when Animals Australia was first doing their first investigations in Egypt and in Jordan. And I didn't want to say this on tape, maybe we can edit this part out. But, so I participated in some, what?
Can you turn your mic off? The missing 2 minutes.
No, I just don't, I don't want this to be on tape and people in the industry to see it. Because I'm researching a book and need access to all the sources. But, so I participated in several undercover investigations with Animals Australia to capture on film what was happening to their sheep upon arrival in Egypt and in Jordan on the Festival of the Sacrifice in particular. So I don't mean that to sound heroic in any way. I was not a person who went into a slaughterhouse. I want to be very clear on that. Because Eid al-Adha, the problem is this individual selling. So we would go to these street markets where you get 100 Australian sheep in a pen, and individuals would come by and buy one to take home, because as I mentioned, people want to slaughter their own animal. So these are the iconic images that sparked the campaign of them being stuffed into trunks, like literally tied to the top of taxi racks, I mean everything imaginable, as well as we went on Eid al-Adha out into the public and filmed, you know, what happens when a cattle in a truck arrives on a street. There's no offloading. Again, and I don't want to exaggerate these things at all, because they're extremely amazing advocates in Egypt who are working on these issues. And I don't mean to suggest that we were foreigners who came in and exposed something, because it was actually the Egyptians who got people into the slaughterhouses. So there were investigations in the slaughterhouses, and the Egyptians like literally put their lives on the line to get people in. So those experiences were just seared in my brain, and I kept thinking, I've got to get back to this, I've got to get back to this. And so when I went back to it, I really thought the story was about live exports and nothing else. But then I realized actually live exports is a piece of a bigger puzzle about the need for live animals and the difference between Australia's halal standards and what Egyptians might accept or Qataris might accept. And it's really a debate about Islamic law. It's a debate that's the same as the polygamy debates, or it's really a debate about where are we going to go and how we're going to get there, and how much you're going to adhere to literalism versus expansive readings of the text, the purpose of the text, things like that. So those experiences just they never left. They never left me, and I wanted to get back to it.
And I'll just add, while you weren't necessarily undercover, you have visited slaughterhouses all over the world as part of your research, correct?
Yeah, but it's different when you're on a tour with someone from the government. No one's going to pull a knife.
Exactly.
Right, yeah, it's a lot. And again, nothing heroic happened. There are heroic people who go undercover into slaughterhouses.
Yeah. All right, well, please join me in thanking Professor Stilt for that presentation. So we'll take about a 10-minute break. There are restrooms right outside the door here and further down the hallway. We'll see you back in. And we have a rule here at Harvard that no one can leave until all the food is gone, so you've got plenty of work to do.